So there we go. Sorry, just recording it so people can miss it, can see it later. So the question that we really wanted to spend some time thinking about is, what is the Jewish perspective on the death penalty? And again, well, maybe we may take a few minute break and transition to my office computer, in which case I can be able to share screen for those on Zoom. But there is a lot of death penalty in the Torah. It's not something that doesn't exist in Torah sources. So it's actually a really interesting question to delve into on a sort of, as much as we can separate ourselves out from the case itself, to analyze that phrase that the Jewish congregation wrote, saying that the death penalty is inconsistent with Jewish values. Now, I'm not arguing with it. I'm just saying it's interesting how we have to therefore go through and look at the sources in Jewish tradition where you see a lot of death penalty, including in the 613 mitzvot. Not only are there many mitzvot, again, the most simple that comes from the earliest part is murder is a death penalty offense in Jewish tradition, in the Torah. And not only that, there's actually a additional mitzvah number 402, I don't know if that's the number, but somewhere along the line there, is lo tichlu kofer lenefesh rotzeach. There was a practice that still exists in many countries, where you could, if a death penalty case was adjudicated guilty, there was an out where the family of the accused, there are different permutations in different societies, could accept money from the accused, except for the victim, would accept money from the accused, and that would spare the accused from getting their punishment of the death penalty. So that's what the practice was in many societies, and there's a mitzvah in the Torah not to do that. V'lo tikfru kofer lenefesh rotzeach, that if there is someone who is adjudicated guilty in a murder trial, you are not allowed to take a monetary allowance to exempt him from that punishment. Yes, Suzanne. You're muted. I ask you to unmute here. I don't hear because you're muted. Let's see if you can unmute.
This is a case. The victim here, which is the Tree of Life Synagogue, wants to pay the kofel, the moral kofel.
Yeah, that's yeah. So exactly right. Exactly bringing up those same issues. So the that's on one hand. On one hand, you do find capital punishment in the Torah. You do find the notion of that being seen as one of the tools in our judicial arsenal. On the other hand, there is a different mitzvah, which says v'hitzilu ha'edah, which describes the way in which a Jewish court is supposed to work, where they are supposed to be biased, so to speak, not to take the life of the accused. Not to, right? V'hitzilu ha'edah means that you do your best to try and find a way, not necessarily to that the person not be accountable for the act that they've done, but not to have the death penalty.
What was the sentence you just said in Haida about
V'hitzilu ha'edah? That means they should save him. The congregation should save him. And if you look in Masechet Makot and Masechet Sanhedrin, they are chock full of sources that talk about all the roadblocks put up in order to stop the death penalty from ever taking place. And of course, you're probably familiar with the famous adage where the rabbis say any court that actually carried out the death penalty once in 7 years is considered a murderous court. And the response to that was, you're wrong. It's a court that did the death penalty once in 70 years was considered a murderous court. So there's clearly a very significant reticence to actually impose the death penalty, which would bring credence to this document written by this congregation to say that it's incompatible with Jewish values for the death penalty to be meted out in this particular case. So By the way, between 1972 and 1976, it was illegal in the United States to effect capital punishment. Now its legality is decided state by state. There are 17 states that don't allow the death penalty, but 33 states do. Now, by the way, there are 194 countries in the United Nations, a little bit fewer than 100. 98 countries have outlawed the death penalty completely in their law books. 49 different additional countries have not implemented, even if it's on the books, not implemented the death penalty in decades. So in what clearly is a majority of countries, the death penalty is not implemented. There are those countries that are well known that make up for the lack by the prolific pace in which they do mete out capital punishment in fairly significant numbers. You have a lot of moral discussions all over the world in many, many different societies. Obviously, the state of Israel has this discussion consistently. You have the question of if they should have the death penalty for convicted terrorists, especially since many terrorists, even convicted of the most serious crimes, are released in prisoner exchanges over the course of time. Gilad Shalit brings an example. So this, again, obviously not weighing in any way right now on any side of the contemporary issue, but it's absolutely a major, major point of conversation and discussion in societies all over the world. What's the rationale, at least within the Torah system, for capital punishment? Because like I said, it exists, it's there over and over and over again. So there are three different ways that you'll see texts in the Torah to be interpreted. You have the pasuk a couple of different texts, but they boil down generally to three basic arguments. The first is deterrence, right? It will be the greatest deterrence for the someone who commits murder, right? For the death, for somebody who commits a capital offense, is, well, if you kill the people who are caught, that sends a message to anybody who does that act that they better be careful not to do this act, because if they were caught, this end will befall them as well. So that will potentially prevent any killer from carrying out this act once they recognize what will happen to them. So that's the first overarching rationale, the notion of deterrence. The second is, I'll use the term retribution. Eye for an eye, so to speak, although Judaism doesn't believe in specifically an eye for an eye, but the concept of shofech dam ha'adam ba'adam damo yishafech, that's the pasuk in Bereshit, that the natural consequence of you taking a life, the only way to truly have accountability to the extreme extent is for your life to be taken. The logical punishment for the act of someone taking a life is them to lose a life. By the way, the argument is made that it also offers a feeling of closure and justice for the family of the victim, who will have perpetual suffering out of the loss of their loved one. The last argument that you see in a variety of different sources is the notion of safety, right? Now, you could argue a life in prison adds that measure of safety of keeping this person away from the community, but the idea is that you, in theory, have the most foolproof way of saving the community from this individual if you end their life, right? You could say there's lots of other alternatives to that third approach. You could imprison them, you could do other things, but that's at least part of the rationale that is given for the notion of the death penalty. The hashkafic approach that you'll see is a fourth approach. There's actually a fourth approach that you don't see so much in the broader society, but you do see in more of, again, the Hashkafic Jewish sources, which say that taking someone else's life forfeits their, I should say, extinguishes their Tselem Elokim, that little piece of God, that godliness within them. And therefore, you lose your capability. Every person has been endowed with the Tselem Elokim, with that, again, that in that image of God, that godliness between them. And the idea of when you take the life of another human being, who, by the way, also had a piece of God within them, you forfeit your right. It's the image of God within you, and therefore you don't have that aspect of Tselem Elokim. That's a sort of logic, but that isn't really a logic. It's more of a theoretical orientation presented by more in the philosophical realm.
Rabbi Posy,
Capital punishment, yeah.
so who are they saying diminishes their Tselem Elohim? The person who actually does it, the person who convicts him to death, who loses their Tselem Elohim?
The rationale in this approach, and Tzadok Blin is the one who writes it more expense, is the person who is the murderer took away the godliness from their victim, and therefore their godliness is taken away. That they forfeit their right to their own godliness by committing this act. That was the approach of those Hasidic thinkers. And again, that's sort of another rationale for Suzanne. You're still muted. You need to unmute. You're still muted. Wait, we don't hear you yet. Let's see if we can get you to unmute. There we go. Go ahead.
Ideological.
There we go. Start again. Sorry.
Again?
I'm sorry. We just started hearing you.
Ideological arguments about morals are beautiful, and we all understand. We think we understand them. But what it lends to at the moment is there are practical things to be thought about.
Yes. Very, very good point. Go ahead.
We should give everyone at least 20 years of life, or how long, unless he is totally brainwashed again from what his original hate theory was. Because all of us are, be it by Islam, be it by Baruch Goldstein was also brainwashed by his religion. Okay, Amir, and the guy who murdered Rabin was also brainwashed by his religion and his rabbis, right? I mean, we have to deal with this brainwashing in our society now. We don't want to get vaccination. And who cares about all the others who might be susceptible then? And all that, we have to do something about unbrainwash those terrible criminals who are also human beings. So we have to give them a brainwashing for years, unless we know, and then we know that if they really repent and see their stuff, then they're okay, until they're brainwashed again by something else. So, I mean, I don't understand what we're gaining with killing people half this. I mean, things which are obvious are obvious. They killed a mass murderer. There were enough people who know what happened. But there are lots of people who are condemned to death because of false testimony. I mean,
So the lack of foolproof, the fact that it's not foolproof and it's so final, so is a big argument. Yeah.
Law and justice have nothing to do with each other, because if something is over the time allowed for a revision, then you're sitting in jail for another 30 years.
Yeah. So it's a absolutely a very fraught issue, which of course we're wading into. But yes, sir. Go ahead.
We have to do something practical, because the morals of the Israeli army cost its lives. It cost the army lives too. But then we are on the high moral horse. But we are blamed anyhow, so it doesn't matter.
Exactly. There's no way to stop that. But let's actually go a little bit back into history, and talk about how, while you'll have a pasuk starting from Bereshit, you have the famous pasuk in Parshat Mishpatim, Makeh ish v'met mot yumat, unambiguous. Yet, the ambivalence is very clear in the oral law. Let me give you an example of what it actually takes to convict a murderer in a court of Jewish law, okay? For example, you have to have 2 adult Jewish witnesses. They have to be Torah observant, keep the commandments. They have to be able to see each other at the time of the act. Now, here's the key. They have to be able to speak clearly, and they're not allowed to have any speech impediment. They have to be able to hear clearly. They can't have any issue because it says Yishma'u. They can't be related to the accused or to each other. And here's the thing. They have to give a warning to the perpetrator immediately preceding the sin, saying that the act they're about to commit is a capital offense, and they have 10 seconds. And if it's delivered more than 10 seconds before the crime, not valid. Now, here's the even bigger kicker. The accused has to respond to them within that 10-second time frame and say, yes, I recognize, I'm familiar with the punishment, I'm going to commit the crime anyway, and then immediately begin the act of the crime. So you can probably count on one hand or 0 hands how many times such a actual scenario actually happened that enough logistics, so to speak, were in place to actually convict a perpetrator of a capital offense. And by the way, that's before you even get to the trial. This will be prima facie reasons to get rid of the testimony in the trial. You have to have 23 judges, of which you must have a majority to convict, but you can't have a unanimous conviction. Basically, it's almost impossible to satisfy every single one of the conviction. So you have a very unique situation where you have a very clearly laid out value and idea in the Torah. Come along the interpreters of the Torah in the Torah Shebaal Peh and take literally all of its teeth out of that halach. So the ambivalence in the historical interpretation of the Torah text about capital punishment is very, very significant. Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon say, had we been in the Sanhedrin times, by the way, it's not even possible nowadays because we don't have the Sanhedrin, but if we had been in the Sanhedrin time, they both said that had we been on the court, there's no way anybody would ever have been convicted in a capital case. Now, by the way, there was one somewhat lone wolf opinion of Rabbi Shimon of the Tanaim who disagreed with this entire approach and said the Torah meant what it says. There should be capital punishment and we shouldn't be scared of it. But that did not seem to be the consensus of the corpus of rabbinic literature over the generations. That was Rabbi Shimon's opinion, but that is, not the case. And interestingly, Rabbi Shimon makes a deterrence-related argument. Rabbi Shimon says, if you rabbis who are so reticent to actually implement the death penalty, there's a famous phrase, which means anybody who is lenient and gives mercy to those who are evil ends up being evil to those who are innocent. Rabbi Shimon told his contemporaries, you're letting a lot more innocent people die by the fact that you're so reticent to be tough on the murderer. Which, basically saying you're opening the door to murder with impunity. Now, Rabbeinu Nisim, hundreds of years later, wrote a very, very powerful treatise where he threaded a middle ground. He says, it is absolutely true that the Torah, and by the way, the rabbis didn't make up any of these detailed requirements. They are all gleaned from the text of the Torah itself. So Rabbeinu Nisim said, the Torah meant what it said. when it said there should be capital punishment, but it also meant when it said when it gave you the tools, God was clear when he gave you these tools to acquit almost anybody who comes in front of a court. Again, one interesting caveat is if you have a unanimous verdict that not one person can find an exculpatory approach to this individual, then we say something's wrong and we throw out the whole court case. A unanimous jury, or I should say unanimous group of jurists, actually leads to a hung jury. Fascinating. So Rabbeinu Nisim.
So that's the opposite of our system.
Yeah. So Rabbeinu Nisim actually had a very innovative approach where he said that that's not the way the Torah meant a society to run. Rabbi Shimon's point is a good point, that if you have no ability to implement any sort of consequences, then you have done a great disservice to society, because there's people out there who are of not the greatest moral character. We just got to can't ignore that. Not everybody is, the greatest moral, upstanding individual. People make mistakes and do bad things, and you need to have accountability in there for the bad things that they do. So he suggests, based on his interpretation of a parsha in Sefer Dvarim, that the Torah actually recommends that there be two parallel systems. There is the system of these courts who have these restrictions, and they're expressing godly wisdom of the fact that we want to be very clear, and that all the religious values that underlie the jurisprudence laws. However, he says there's also a rule called the Melech, and the Melech does not have any of these restrictions. And the Melech can create a police force and an army and a civil defense and civil workforce, civil servant workforce, that does not have to have all of these loopholes. He can make rules of his own that would be in place and would impact the way that the Torah would allow punishments to take place. So this king would be able to create a police force, be able to create a judiciary even, that would prosecute crimes and not be bound by this onerous set, so to speak, quote unquote, onerous set of godly regulations. And that's the way they would keep the peace. And each king, depending on what society and what approach they take, could do it as they wanted to. So, for example, if you think about the comparison between the UK and the US, right? So the UK does not allow almost all police officers to carry firearms. In the US, firearm use is very, very common. Talk about Israel, everybody has a firearm, but there's almost no gun violence. So, the idea would be that the license and the culture can dictate how exactly they want to approach this this concept of, a daily world of public safety that is under the rubric of the king, when we would have a Jewish king under the rubric of the Melech. Throughout history, so just to recap, we've shown a tightrope that we try to walk, right? We have all of these reasons, these rationales: deterrence, safety, spirituality, this equity/retribution, reasons to have capital punishment, and frankly, again, to deter others from murdering. On the other hand, Judaism inherently has in it so many softer sides to it, so many concepts, the idea of being rachamanim, right, to be people of mercy. And there's clearly an ambivalence in the rabbinic literature, exactly through the time of the Mishnah, of how to balance that, again, delicate tightrope. The Mishnayot is that, the values that underlie this question are frankly the same values that underlie so many of our other things. For example, interestingly, there is a halacha that a judge must be married and a parent. A judge in Jewish law who might be sitting on such a case must be married and they must have children. Why? Because that develops, or at least a broader family, that develops this sense of mercy. If you are connected to a family member, that develops a sense of mercy within you. And that is something that is an expectation and a requirement for, judges. To be able to truly sit in judgment, you have to have developed that sense of mercy within yourself. That was the law. Now, there's an interesting period in Jewish history. Under Roman rule, it was like the wild, wild Middle East. There was a very high incidence. It was a time of very difficult upheaval in the Jewish world. And there was a pretty high incidence of murder within the Jewish community. They weren't going to amend the Jewish law to talk about all those things. But this is, by the way, 40 years. The rabbis did something very, very interesting. They disbanded the Sanhedrin, or specifically, they closed the Sanhedrin offices on the Temple Mount. And the Sanhedrin it's forbidden to judge when they're not in their offices, in their Lishkat HaGazit in the Temple Mount. And they closed that. That meant that the Sanhedrin couldn't rule. When it couldn't rule, it couldn't follow these loopholes. And with nothing left, they had an alternative justice system that meted out very serious and severe punishments to people who were actually committing murder. So there's a period in Jewish history, about 40 years before the destruction of the Second Temple, where they were able to try capital cases, and they did some legal wrangling and maneuvering so that it wouldn't contravene Jewish law. Interestingly, the sad aspect of it was it didn't work. And murders continued to proliferate. And they abandoned capital punishment for a different reason, because they said it's meant mainly as a deterrent and people aren't getting deterred. There's no reason to have capital punishment if people actually aren't getting deterred by seeing what the consequences of capital punishment are. So they stopped their ability to try capital cases, but they didn't put anything in the end in place, replacing it for the long term, because they said it wasn't actually effective as a deterrent.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
Was it at the time of the Sikarim?
Yes. So there was there were a variety of different sects, including them, that played into this delicate dichotomy of capital punishment in
It was
Jewish.
terrorism time.
Yeah. Now, Rab Shrira Gaon had a really interesting shaila that was raised to him. And let me see if I can find the text here in the Igeret of Rab Shrira Gaon. Here we go. Rab Shrira Gaon writes the following, and then I'll give you the context. Rab Shrira Gaon, the Gaonim were the period immediately following the end of the Talmud. Nowadays, if someone commits murder in today's day and age, ein biadenu, meaning we have no power as the Jewish communal justice system after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash many years before that. Lo lahorgo, we can't kill him. Lo lachovto, we can't hit him, can't give him corporal punishment. Ein biadenu laso l'uma, we can do nothing to him. Lo lahalgoto, we can't even kick him out into exile. He is excommunicated from the community with some very draconian measures. For example, he's no longer eligible to be part of a minyan. You can't mix with him in familial settings. You can't get married to his, and he's not allowed to marry in the community. You're not allowed to look at him or at his likeness. And he is invalid for any testimony of any sort in the world. So, that basically, Rav Shrira Gaon was saying we can only use accepted communal sanctions against someone because we don't have other tools at our disposal. So there was a case where he, well, actually, I'll go a little earlier, about 100 years earlier, about 800 BCE, in the Common Era, there was another Gaon, Rabbi Nitzunai Gaon. Rabbi Nitzunai Gaon was asked that once we don't have the tools for capital punishment, what should you do? So they suggested maybe we should give him lashes. Right, that's another punishment that exists, and that would be the Jewish court couldn't give a capital offense because the government wouldn't allow it also. And we didn't have the Sanhedrin in place, but he says you can't give it, says you can't give the person lashes because, interestingly, how dare you ever give him a punishment less than he deserves, lest people think that that is the appropriate punishment for the Avera he did. It's better not to give him any punishment, even corporal punishment, which is something we do find in Jewish law, because it's sending the wrong message that people think that murder is punishable only by lashes. Which, again, a very interesting approach by Rabbi Nitzunai Gaon. But again, he also said that you must excommunicate that person from the community. And by the way, in those years, communal affiliation was a make or break for your life. You had to be registered and connected to an established community, either of the Christian, Muslim, or Jewish, or whatever the other religious community you would have. So being excommunicated from the Jewish community, and there was no such thing at that time before conversion to any other community, was a very severe sentence in terms of, it was sort of the end of that person's ability to function in communal life. But they weren't killed or imprisoned, and that's the key, or lashed, and that's the key that both Rabbi Nitzunai and Rosh Hashanah are going right about. There was an interesting case raised by the Rashba. The Rashba in Siman Shin Mem Tet deals with the following case. He was asked the following question: Sha'alta ba'artzeinu. You asked, in our nature, in our country at that time, I think in Spain, Yesh Tnaim min hakilot, there was an accepted communal agreement. Sheh Kol Yehudi sheyaharog Yehudi yihareg, that if us in the community would find someone committing murder, the community would take care of that person. A Jew killed another Jew, and what happened? Hamelech machal lo hariga, almanat shed nitzaveh alav lasot kol darim sheyesh lo lasot minidu v'galut kiyotze bezeh. So what happened? This fellow who was an accused murderer was also a wealthy man and slipped a bribe to the king and obtained a royal pardon. So this fellow came to the Spanish king who had committed murder, and clearly the facts of the case weren't in dispute, and he got a pardon from the king. And the Jewish community asks the Rashba, what do we do? This fellow bought his way out of punishment. So he writes the following. Dvar Torah, based on the Torah itself, meaning the text of the Torah, Ein zanin dinei nefashot. We are not able to sit in judgment in capital cases. Based on a pasuk, min hamakom ahu, that you can only do it when the Sanhedrin are in the Lishkat HaGazid, in the Temple Mount. V'kol sheSanhedrin yoshim b'shil Lishkat dinei nefashot b'chol makom ein dinei nefashot. There can be no capital cases. Aval kol shera'u sheSanhedrin shakilot ladun v'ligdor b'divrei adar paretz. But communities are not totally handcuffed. They have the ability to put in place local regulations that can make someone who commits such a heinous act accountable. And they can make up whatever they want. And that's how far he goes. Listen to this. Aval kol shera'u hakilot, and anything that the community sees, shalom min Torah, which might not be found, ladun, to adjudicate, to judge, Viligdor b'fnei dor operates, and to put fences. These are public safety measures in the face of the congregation, the community, the generation that is, scofflaws. And listen to what the Rashba says. You're not going to believe this. If they want to amputate a limb from an accused and convicted murderer, is permitted in Jewish law, says Rabbeinu, the Rashba. Very, very not completely accepted opinion, wild opinion. That is an order for that sense of deterrence. So therefore, says the Rashba to this group of people who were dealing with this murderer who got a royal pardon, says, do whatever you want. Alma, you could gouge out his eyes. You can decree upon him that he should have a lasher or be excommunicated. Whatever is what the community deems as an appropriate punishment. So they weren't asking what to do to this guy. They're asking, what are our options? And Rashba says the options other than death are all on the table. You can even incarcerate him with no hope for parole. The only thing you can't do is declare a adjudication of the death penalty and then kill him right away. So basically the Rashba says this is the abolition of the death penalty for perpetuity in Jewish law. However, he doesn't say we should go soft on crime, so to speak. He says that we must have other tools in place that will achieve the goals that are meant for the expectation of accountability that you have within every society. The Rambam actually writes, based on a similar idea, where he says, halacha l'maaseh, practical rule is, it's appropriate and it's accepted and well known. If a person would do an avera for which it's a capital offense, then we can't actually kill him because we can't have capital punishment. You impose upon him a lifetime excommunication. And by the way, you could make the argument that this is in a certain regard a lifetime of prison where you're separated from your community and society and not able to be paroled, not able to get out. There's no parole in this system the way that the Rambam lays it out. He says that that's appropriate because we can't kill him. We can't do capital punishment. So we have all of these alternatives in place that can be quite serious and quite draconian. Now, we'll get to a second in the loophole aspect of it, but what does this say about Jewish values? Which way is it? Are we meant to have mercy on the killer or go above and beyond to address exact accountability from the person on behalf of the victim? Which is it? And we're seeing that it seems to be that on one hand, the death penalty is off the table in Jewish law, but the why isn't what you think. You might think the reason is because we just want to have Rahmanas, Nebuch, to take someone's life on purpose. Has enough blood been spilled already? You spilt the blood of the victim. Now we got to spill your blood? I believe it's Norway who has that approach that they don't have the death penalty and they don't even have long-term incarceration. I think 16 years is the maximum. And there was this fellow, Anders Breivik, this horrible mass murderer who went on this shooting rampage, killed many people. I think it was Norway. And I think they're putting him away for 16 years. And that is what it is. Because they don't have life imprisonment in their country because of exactly this idea. But if you look carefully at the rationale offered by many of these Mefarshim, it's not so simple because they don't use the mercy argument to explain why they don't give capital punishment. And as you saw in some of the earlier sources, they're very graphic about the terrible things you can do to someone who is a convicted murderer. The argument that they present as the reason why we don't have capital punishment nowadays is purely one of technicality. The Torah says the only way to inflict capital punishment, to mete out capital punishment, is with the Sanhedrin sitting in their offices, the Lishkat HaGazid on the Temple Mount, and once they're not there, all bets are off. And we even saw in some of the Gaonim where they say not only are all bets off, but you don't even give the person corporal punishment because you're not supposed to give somebody a lesser punishment than what is actually described in the Torah. So what's actually described in the Torah is the punishment of Malka, of the death penalty. We can't do it, but if we would give him a lesser penalty, we would be considering ourselves in violation of what the Torah said. The Torah said to kill him, didn't say to give him Malchus or something else. So in a certain regard, we leave the fellow without any absolution, and with very serious draconian communal sanctions, but we don't do the death penalty. And again, you could read that as saying, at the end of the day, our mercy wins out, or godly mercy wins out, or you could say it has nothing to do with mercy. We plan on having zero mercy for this individual who did this terrible crime. It's just that there is this technical reason, a pasuk that says, a pasuk, a verse in the Torah that says, oh, you can't give out capital punishment. I'm sorry, that you can't give up without the Sanhedrin where they're supposed to be. So it's a really delicate and questionable topic because on one hand, the board of directors of that synagogue are correct. It does not comport with Jewish values because Jewish values in today's day and age and with our infrastructure do not allow for Jews to mete out capital punishment. So if it's against, so if you would ask me, is it against Jewish law to mete out capital punishment? I will tell you yes. In which case, the board of directors that wrote that giving this individual the capital punishment, putting him to death and executing him is in a violation of Jewish values, it's technically correct in that Jewish law would not allow for the death penalty nowadays. It's a little bit more questionable if it is in the spirit of what Jewish law says, that maybe there can be things that are so heinous that indeed is the correct response. And we are not having mercy on this fellow. Realistically, he's getting it away, and we try to do whatever sanction we can to exact that accountability. But it's not based on a rachmanis on the fellow. And that's a very, very big difference. Is the aversion to capital punishment because we have rachmanis, we have no desire to see more people in pain, so we don't want to kill this guy who, even though he committed murder? Or is it that, no, we would love to kill him? That's exactly what we should be doing. It's just that we have this technical stumbling block, which we don't have a way of getting around. So that's sort of the way the battle lines are drawn in the capital punishment question of what exactly are the Jewish values regarding this. Now, we will continue to point out that Jewish values, one thing that is clear and unequivocal is our reverence for human life. So if we're going to deprive somebody of their human life, there should be a very, very strong, compelling argument to do it, right? We break Shabbos to save a human life. We will do every single Avera in the positive commandments in the Torah to avoid taking a human life. And whether we like it or not, this murderer has a human life. Now, the way we started from Netanyahu was that I know Tzadok kept saying from Lublin, which is that this person has forfeited that status. for us to care about him the same way we care about a heart attack patient in the hospital. By committing murder, they have forfeited that status that the person who's calling the ambulance at 2:00 in the morning, we rush to the hospital, we rush them to the hospital, and we even drive home without any shred of hesitation because Jewish life is so important. Human life is so important. We never want pikuach nefesh, doches kol mitzvos b'Torah. In this case, the fellow seems to have taken himself out of that category of somebody who has the license for pikuach nefesh to allow for his salvation. That's Rav Tzadok's approach. Everyone else says no. Yisrael b'shachata Yisrael, that an individual is always better than their worst moments. It can be defined by more than the worst moment. And this fellow's worst moment was committing murder. But we don't want him defined that way. And therefore, we're going to do all sorts of other things, but we're not going to do capital punishment. So it's a really interesting, again, no answers here, but I think it's a really interesting set of questions that underlie this type of thing, where this congregation wrote unequivocally that it's against Jewish values to do capital punishment. And I would say it's not that simple, but it ends up being practically that way. And again, there's so much more to talk about of this notion of, is it Rahmanas or is it something more technical? Does Judaism truly believe in capital punishment? But if they do, then you have a whole ream of rabbinic literature that seems strange, but they do their utmost, even with all of the infrastructure in place, to make sure that somebody does not get put to death. So that sounds a little bit more on the Rahmanas angle, that we have this aspect of mercy. A judge needs to be able to have mercy to be able to truly sit in judgment and potentially deprive someone of their freedom or of their life. So that's the aspect of the debate as the lines are drawn, so to speak, on capital punishment. I don't know what the right answer is with the tree of life murderer. It seems like at least some in the community are saying, again, I would say also the aspect here is a little bit more moot, because part of what they're saying is that it's not per se that we're against the death penalty. It's just that the way it's meted out in this country is so convoluted and so pain-inducing that it's going to cause us this terrible ordeal. We just want none of it. But again, the concept you do see is so much aversion to taking human life in Jewish law, and that I would say expands out to this question of what should be our approach in the broader system. Again, no answers, just questions. In the broader system, in the countries in which we live, how we should approach that notion of capital punishment. Go ahead, Suzanne.
So at the moment, all the people who don't want to have capital punishment want to put these people in jail for it as long as they can do it.
Right.
It doesn't help the problem. It doesn't do anything. We have to change the
No, you're right in terms of, does mass and elongated incarceration provide all the goals that we want? Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
The murderer forfeited, he is no longer a human, he's a subhuman, okay? He's not an animal, but he's not the tzelem anymore. He lost his tzelem. Rachmanim should make him want to regain the tzelem, and the only way is to learn from the totalitarian governments and put them in re-education, right? I mean, we have to re-educate them. They are benighted.
Yeah. But anyway, it is a sad and scary topic, but something that is part of a very significant moral debate. And Be'ezrat Hashem, we should be able to transition soon to happier topics and to be able to share smachot together. So I want to wish everyone a great Shabbos, and we look forward to being able to continue and getting back on our learning each Thursday afternoon.
I had one question.
Yeah.
Okay.